You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast produced by Veteran Strategies and featuring conversations with fascinating and impactful men and women who have shaped our world, our communities, and our history. My name is Robert Vane, Principal of Veteran Strategies, and your host for our discussion. You are listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn, and NFP, a national insurance broker with strong local content. Our podcast is featured on the All Indiana Podcast Network in partnership with Wish TV. You may find Leaders and Legends at allindianapodcastnetwork.com. Thinking of starting a podcast or need to host a public meeting? Let Leaders and Legends LLC be your partner as you look for new ways to communicate your message. Please contact Chris Spangle or me at leadersandlegends.net. And as always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of P.E. McAllister. Thank you for listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Edward Ted Aldrich. He is an international banker and commodity specialist. Please explain the stock market to me before the end of this podcast because I don't understand it. He lives in Connecticut. And what he does, besides help people, is write. And he is coming on the Leaders and Legends podcast today to talk about his book, The Partnership. George Marshall, Henry Stimson, and the extraordinary collaboration that won two. Aldrich, thank you for coming on the podcast.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me. I love your podcast, and I'm really looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you so much. I loved your book. I learned quite a bit, actually. And we've had a lot of American historians, particularly, let's say, military historians on the podcast, and we always learn something. But I have to say that in your book, I had no clue, while I knew that they got along and formed a dynamic partnership, how critical the personal relationship between George Marshall, who was the Army Chief of Staff, and Henry Stimson, who was the Secretary of War during World War II, both of them, the personal relationship, how much it mattered. Is that what made you decide to write this book?
That was definitely part of it. The concept of teamwork has always appealed to me, whether it's been in business or in sports. So that was a part of it. And it was extraordinary how closely they worked and how they worked. Like I had a tag team approach, and their offices were adjoining, and they never once during the war closed the door between them. And they did that for a couple of reasons. One, they talked to each other 4 or 5 times a day. So as being both practical and pragmatic men, they probably didn't feel like opening the door and shutting it so many times. But I think more importantly, they were really sending a message to their respective staffs, both excellent staffs on either side, that there were no secrets between the civilian head and the military head. And the staffs worked seamlessly together to a point where a few of them couldn't really figure out after the war who they reported to, whether it was Stimson or Marshall or both. The other reason I wrote the book is because while everyone's heard of George Marshall from the Marshall Plan, honestly, not many people really appreciate what his role was during the war as head of the Army and Air Force. Of course, the Air Force was part of the Army during and before World War II. And then nobody's heard of Stimson, but that's not unusual. Nobody's really heard of the Chief of Staff of the Civil War, who was Henry Halleck, and no one's heard of the Chief of Staff of the World War I, Peyton March, and the Secretaries of War. People know Stanton pretty well, Edwin Stanton, but the Secretary of War during World War I was Newton Baker, and he's largely unknown. I felt that their contribution was so extraordinary that I had to remind people who they were. There are plenty of biographies of Marshall, but there were hardly any on Stimson, and certainly none on the both of them. In fact, I'm not a writer. I'm a banker, as you mentioned in the introduction, and a reader. I've spent a lot of time commuting on trains from Connecticut to New York and reading a lot. And I assumed someone had written a book about these two guys. And when I looked to find it and couldn't, I thought, wow, infrastructure being what it is in the Northeast, I have a lot of time on these trains which are delayed and slowing down to write this. So that's what got me started on the project.
I am going to gift a copy of your book to a friend of mine just because you didn't ask for World War One. When you went down that road, I thought, oh my God, he's going to go, Robert, do you know who the Secretary of War was during World War One? And I would have had no clue. So please forget, you're going to sell more book, I guarantee. Let's talk a bit, please, about the setup, because you are using the term Secretary of War, and not many of them were or are well known. I would assume Henry Knox would be on that list only because he was military. Famous Secretary of Defense would have been Robert McNamara. But in 1947, they reorganized sort of the national security and military organizations here in the States. Prior to that, tell why there was a Secretary of War and a Secretary of the Navy, and why things were different, and you didn't have that one civilian over everything.
I think when George Washington named his first cabinet, and there was really nothing in the Constitution other than, I guess there's a sentence saying that the executive office will have some people in various departments, but they didn't really identify them. And I think there were four originally: Treasury, State, and I don't know the real reason they separated Navy and Army, but they did. And I guess Henry Knox probably was the first. So I don't know the reason why it wasn't, but I can tell you that over the years, it's enough about military history to know the Navy and the Army never got along. And I think they were very much going to protect that position in the cabinet. And probably politically, there was never a really good time to introduce the concept of combining them until after the war, when Stimson and Marshall were very much in favor of it, as were most of Stimson's staff, and they could push it through to Truman.
What did Henry Stimson do prior to the war? We could do a whole podcast on his career, before the war, but succinctly set up how Henry Stimson, a Republican, was the point of him being named to Franklin Delano Roosevelt, a Democrat.
Stimson was a Wall Street lawyer, pretty elite guy, born and raised in New York, Phillips of Andover, really elite private school, Harvard number 2 in his class, Yale number 2 in his class, and Harvard Law number 2 or 3 in his class. Then he worked for Elihu Root, who had one of the most prestigious law firms in New York at the time, later became Winthrop Stimson when Root went on to Washington to serve under Teddy Roosevelt and William McKinley first and Teddy Roosevelt. And he became very quickly a top lawyer. And then his friend, Teddy Roosevelt, and I always have to repeat this to people because Stimson's career was so long that he was actually friends with Teddy Roosevelt. Like they were friends. Roosevelt was 9 years older than him, but they had a lot in common in particularly not just politics, but also their pursuit of seeking thrills. Stimson had nothing on Roosevelt when it came to climbing the mountains, going into the woods for months at a time with just a gun and a sack of books. So they really got along well. And then Stimson was offered by Teddy Roosevelt to be U.S. Attorney for the Southern District of New York in 1906, just when the nation was going after monopolies. And he was in the perfect position. He really performed well in that service and became known as a wise man before Evan Thomas and Walter Isaacson coined that word in the book, The Wise Man, later on. He was probably the first wise man, although there's a case for Elihu Root as well. I think the difference is Root stopped practicing law, whereas Stimson would go back and forth between practicing law and when the country needed him. Coolidge had him solve a civil war in the Dominican Republic, I think. He was Governor General of the Philippines. He was, of course, Secretary of War in 1911. So I should have started with Secretary of War in 1911. Then he did work for Coolidge, Secretary of State under Herbert Hoover, where he came up with the Stimson Doctrine. So he was just a wise man who went back and forth like the people following the World War II generation, largely his proteges, who were these guys who served along the Northeast Corridor, mainly lawyers, a few bankers. And when their party called them to service, they would serve and then go back to what they were doing. I suppose the real difference is that Stimson, although he was a Republican, he was absolutely bipartisan, and going way back to the 19th century, late 19th century, he abandoned the Republican Party when he disagreed with Grover Cleveland's views on tariffs. And similarly, abandoned the party, not abandon the party, but he wouldn't vote for them or do anything to support them because of the isolationist views in the 30s and early 40s of the Republican Party. So that's his background.
You mentioned the Stimson doctrine. What is the Stimson doctrine?
When China invaded Manchuria, Japan invaded Manchuria, and the League of Nations really was powerless. We weren't part of it. And Stimson wrote this memo that basically said that the U.S. wasn't going to recognize, and the world should not recognize, territory taken over aggressively and without just cause. Something to that effect.
Putting political parties aside for a second, Franklin Roosevelt asked Henry Stimson to be a Secretary of War. Now, besides the crossing the aisle angle, what was the other reason or reasons why Franklin Roosevelt needed someone like Henry Stimson? Politics be damned.
There's quite a few reasons. One, he trusted Stimson, and he knew Stimson had no political agenda. After Hoover lost to Roosevelt in the 32 election, Stimson went way out of his way to brief the Secretary of State, Hull, about and to brief Roosevelt. He actually went up to Hyde Park and spent half a day with Roosevelt, just laying on the line all the issues of the world. And Roosevelt thought that was a great gesture, certainly not one his boss Hoover would have done, because Hoover and Roosevelt didn't really get along. So he trusted him. There was no political agenda. But I think more importantly, Roosevelt, in his heart, was an interventionist. He was not an isolationist, but publicly, to stay in office, 85% of the country were isolationists. So publicly, he had to be one as well. And he wanted someone in the office, although it was nice to have a Republican to show unity, it was more, he wanted a guy who was an interventionist in there, and someone who would only go as far as Roosevelt let him go. So it was a combination of Stimson's positions, his stature. Stimson, like Marshall, was known for integrity, and that would help him deal with Congress. So there are a lot of positive reasons to go with Stimson. And someone who, among others, who whispered that in his ear was Felix Frankfurter, who was a protege of Stimson's. Stimson hired him in 1906 when he was right out of Harvard Law School, and they stayed friends throughout their life. And Frankfurter urged Roosevelt to put Stimson in the cabinet.
And Felix Frankfurter, famous Supreme Court justice.
Yes.
Non-interventionism, isolationism. Anyone with a cursory knowledge of American history understands what those mean. But the power, the political power behind those stances, how much of that, in your view, is related to just America's founding in 1776 or 1789, or Washington's farewell address where he says, avoid entangling alliances? And how much of that, given the era, was directly related to our participation towards the end in the Great War?
There's so many factors in no particular order. Certainly, Washington's farewell address had something to do with, as well as America's general fear of a large army. America's complacency had something to do with it. Marshall would go around before the war and he'd give speeches saying, listen, we won the Revolutionary War, but we had 10 times as many soldiers as the British. We won the War of 1812, but we had 30 times as many soldiers. And yes, we helped win the First World War, but we didn't start fighting for nearly 4 years after it began. So these were other factors as well. Americans were complacent. They just thought if something happened, we could just do what we've always done, grab the gun off the fireside mantle and go to battle. So these are the reasons. But I think another key reason was just our geographical position. If you look at a map of the U.S. at that time and today, looking at the lower 48 states, you realize on the Atlantic coast, it's, say, 3,500 miles to Europe. On the Pacific coast, you're protected by an ocean of 5,500 miles to Japan. You had Canada, which was as friendly now as it was then. And you had Mexico, which is never really a threat. So Americans, particularly less than 25 years after the First World War, just thought, why do we need to bail out Europe in one of their forever wars? Because they've been fighting wars for 1,000 years. And we lost a lot of money and lost a lot of soldiers during that war. Why do we need to do this? We're protected. And I think what they got wrong was a number of things, how interconnected the world is. And that's where Stimson comes in, because he understood this by his position as an advisor to some of the key corporations in the US and Europe. A lot of people think that the concept of globalization just started in the early 20th century, but for hundreds of years, the world's been connected. And the other thing was people didn't appreciate air power. Nobody appreciated air power. So when they looked and thought they were protected until Pearl Harbor, people just didn't realize, they just didn't think that we were vulnerable through the air.
You do a terrific job in your book discussing Stimson's relationship with government and business leaders around the world. Like, he understood how the web worked, the web of commerce, the web of threats, the web of fascist governments. And to me, that's one of the things, again, that you detail so well is the first wise man. I think he proved it when it came to, you may be sitting in Topeka, Kansas, but let me tell you.
Yes.
You're a hell of a lot closer to Paris and Tokyo than you think you are.
Oh, absolutely. And again, it's certainly I would say the Midwest is where isolation was the strongest, because you're not near the ports where trade is done. People don't really have the same appreciation. But Stimson had the benefit, again, of not just advising America's largest corporate leaders, but also Europeans. And he sat on so many conferences, economic conferences, so he knew the relative GDPs and potential industrial capabilities of all the powers on both sides. So he had all this appreciation and knew that America's interests would suffer greatly if Hitler took over Europe.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. Our guest today is Ted Aldrich. He is the author of The Partnership, George Marshall, Henry Stimson, and the Extraordinary Collaboration That Won World War II. You mentioned at the beginning of the podcast, George Marshall is certainly much better known. The Marshall Plan, obviously, is much better known than his partner, Secretary Stimson. Marshall's path, which and one of the great ironies of American history is they always seem to have these convergent dates, but he becomes Army Chief of Staff, I think on September 1st, 1939, which is the same day that Hitler invades Poland and begins World War II. Marshall's career, is it fair to say, because he did not have the same background as Stimson, he went to the Virginia Military Academy, Institute, not West Point. Is it fair to say that Marshall early in his career caught the eye of superiors who realized this man is a soldier and we need him in command wherever that may be in case of a future war?
Absolutely. There used to be a form you'd fill out after someone served under you, and it was a standard form. And the last question always was, would you have this guy serve under you again? And a couple people said, not just that, but I'd be happy to serve under him. I can't imagine anyone had a better service record than Marshall ever. And there were people when he was still below the grade of captain that said there aren't 5 people in the military that are better than this guy. He not only was always number one at the various war colleges he went to, but he also became known as the best teacher, and he then became known as the best staff officer. And that's the real curse, is when you're a great staff officer, you end up not getting promotions, because promotions are given, whether in peace or war, to those in command of troops. But his record was so great that prominent generals had the ability to just pluck him out and get them on their staffs. And that's what happened. And that's how he got introduced to Pershing. The general whose name escapes me, who was head of the 1st Division, had Stimson on his staff, and they went over they were the 1st Division over to Europe during World War I. And they were giving exercises, war exercises, and Pershing was observing them. And when it was over, the general in charge, along with his staff, 5 members of staff, including Marshall, gathered around Pershing to get feedback. And Pershing just lit into the group, particularly the general. He said, "You guys are a disgrace to the uniform. Those were disgraceful exercises. I don't know how we're going to win the war with people like you. I don't know what you've been doing over here." And he was going on, and everyone is just staring at their shoes and taking it. And Marshall said, very forcefully, he said, "General Pershing, you're being completely unfair." And Pershing glared at him and grunted something and started to walk away. And Marshall, and this is Marshall, a young Marshall during World War I, grabbed Pershing's arm and said, "Hold on. I've been here the longest in the first division. I have something to say, and you need to listen to me. And then for the next 5 minutes, in what Marshall would later say was a very inspired 5 minutes, he just described all the shortages they faced, the disadvantages they had, how they were solving all the problems before they went to bed at night and then faced the new ones in the morning. And he was in effect saying, instead of criticizing us, you should be thanking us. Pershing was still hot under the collar and stormed off. And when he did, the general and the other four staff just looked up at Marshall and looked and said, "What are you thinking?" and started wishing him farewell because they thought he would be sent home. Marshall, on the other hand, as he was walking away, he turned to his staff member who was there with him and said, "When we're in communication with the First Division, I want it to be through that kid Marshall." And shortly thereafter, he grabbed him and poached him from the First Division, and he served for the rest of the war on Pershing staff. At the end of the war, he didn't get a promotion. And MacArthur, who joined the Army a year after Marshall, got to be general 16 years earlier because no one really wanted MacArthur on his staff, but they didn't mind him commanding troops. So it shows this interesting dichotomy between his service record and his lack of promotions, but it was all because his service record was so fantastic. It was very ironic.
What was the relationship? You mentioned it. World War I was the training ground for some, but not all of the World War II generals. Patton famously had a terrific service record in the Great War. I can't remember. MacArthur received like 7 silver stars, or he just got all these medals during the Great War. How did Marshall take not being a frontline commanding officer?
He couldn't stand it. He couldn't stand it. He tried multiple times to get out of it, but he couldn't. He was too valuable. His main contribution to the war, and it didn't go unnoticed, was towards the end of the war, the French and the English wanted to do the final offensive, and Pershing wanted to do something else. There was a line called the Saint-Michel salient, and he wanted to fight there first before joining the offensive. And he negotiated with Marshal Foch from the French. And the deal was, all right, you can fight that battle, but you have to be at the front line within 10 days of that battle. And it was 60 miles away. And Pershing put Marshall in charge of the logistics. And basically, he had to move 400,000 troops, 90,000 horses and mules, 3,000 guns, 40,000 tons of equipment over 60 miles in less than 10 days. And there were other troops going in reverse. It was a logistical nightmare. And he did it in 9 days. And both Pershing and Foch didn't think it would be possible. He succeeded, and he was considered a wizard after that. It was so impressive that there was a guy serving on Pershing's staff named Dwight Morrow, who was the number 2 guy at J.P. Morgan at the time, and later the father-in-law of Charles Lindbergh. And Dwight Morrow was so impressed with what Marshall pulled off that he offered him a job at J.P. Morgan at $30,000 a year. And to give you an idea what this amount of money was, Stimson was one of the highest paid lawyers in New York, earning never more than $20,000 a year. So it would have made Marshall a very wealthy man. And Marshall had every reason to leave because he didn't even get promoted. He felt slighted. But his sense of duty was so over the top, he turned it down because he felt he owed the U.S. quite a bit for what they'd given him, and he thought he had a lot more to give to the Army. So he turned it down. So that's his World War I experience.
Where was Stimson during World War
I? So this is hard to believe. As I mentioned, he was Secretary of War in 1911, and he was a power broker, if you will. He also had an outsized sense of duty. And when he missed the Spanish-American War in 1897 or 1898, he was working as a lawyer. He couldn't forgive himself. It's not because he was like Teddy Roosevelt, that he was a warmonger. He just thought it was the duty of every American male to fight for his country. So he said, that'll never happen again. And he started training once a week with the National Guard and did so for years, decades. And then in the summer, they spent 3 weeks training. No war came until he was 50 years old, 50. And he used all his influence and contacts, being the person he was, to get into that war. Now, we all know people from the 20th century who used their influence to get out of war or to get cushy assignments during war. He wanted to be in artillery then. And so the various powers that be said, no problem. It's okay. And Marshall and Stimson always had that attitude. When people try to have favors done for their kids or their nephews or friends, if it was going into a danger zone, they had no problem cutting red tape, but they wouldn't do it for a cushier assignment. So he served as an artilleryman in France, lobbing shells under the Germans and taking shells as a 50-year-old. Quite remarkable.
And a millionaire by any standard.
Oh, by any standard. Very wealthy guy.
You are listening to the Leaders and Legends podcast. It's presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmon Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, and the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. Our guest is Ted Aldrich. We're discussing his book, The Partnership, George Marshall, Henry Stimson, and the extraordinary collaboration that won World War II. The 20s and the 30s are famous for being a no man's land, no pun intended, for military careers, but Marshall stayed in. How did Marshall, who famously, as you said, didn't get promotions, the 20s and 30s were certainly a dead zone for military careers. We cut back on our spending. The list goes on. How does George Marshall get to be a 4-star general and Army Chief of Staff in September of 39?
It was a slow process. Marshall was one of those guys who was a unique soldier during that time, in that era, during peace. You know, the soldiers are still stations for political reasons, and a lot of these forts, which were set up originally to look after Native Americans, but now political pressures would keep the forts there, even they were obsolete, and the Army was very spread out. And Marshall would go around and serving in these various places, doing assignments. And he was the type of guy. Other soldiers during that era would, when their activities were over, they would hunt, play sports, drink a lot, chase women. Marshall's one of those guys none of us would have liked. He would study battle plans. And he believed in his heart that his duty was to assume that sometime in the next month, there's going to be a war. So he made it his job to outperform everyone else, and his record maintained its excellence that it had prior to the war. But because he was known to be such a good teacher, I think how he really came into the notice of people was he took over Fort Benning and completely changed how teaching was done in the military, simplifying things. It was always, he had some mentors who believed in this concept of just keeping things simple. I'll just give a quick anecdote. When he took over this job as running the main war college at Fort Benning in Georgia, there was a practice where the officers at the end of a semester, if you will, would give a 45-minute presentation on some battle or some war. Marshall immediately cut that to 15 minutes, and he said, no notes. And after a couple of weeks of people going through their presentations, people started complaining to him, saying 15 minutes isn't nearly enough time to talk about the things we want to talk about. So Marshall looked at a guy in the front row and said, you got a watch? He said, yeah. He goes, all right, time me from now. He said, I'm going to give you a lecture on the history of the Civil War, how it started, the strategies and the execution of those strategies from both the southern and the northern side, how it ended, and the consequences of everything. And when he finished, he asked the guy in the front row how much time had elapsed, and it had been less than 5 minutes. So he made his point. So he became really well known. And during World War II, there were 125 generals out there who were considered marshalmen, people that went through his program. The other thing Marshall did during those years that was remarkable is he kept a little black book. And every time he met someone who impressed him, he'd write their name down in this book, what was impressive about them, and how they might be used in the future. For example, Eisenhower, he met in 1919. Eisenhower was given an overlapping duty of working on Pershing's memoirs. And he walked into George Marshall's office, who was more senior to him, and said, look, I have some ideas about the memoirs that you're writing. I think we could zip them up a little. And Marshall rejected his ideas on the spot. And most officers at that time would have just saluted and walked out the door. But Eisenhower continued to sit down and said, hear me out, and very articulately walked through the changes and why they were important. Marshall still rejected it, but after he left, he wrote Eisenhower's name in the book, saying, really bright guy, affable, isn't a yes man, and actually has some creative ideas. Patton, on the other hand, was also in the book, but slightly different notation. I think I'll paraphrase it, but it was something like complete nut job. But if you give him a tank command, he'd be the best if you can keep him on a short leash. So he had all these men's names written down in his black book. And when it came time to being chief of staff, he could just fill all these positions. And he did so almost flawlessly by pulling out the names out of the black book and assigning them based on their characteristics. How he got noticed by Roosevelt was through a guy named Harry Hopkins, who, of course, was the Roosevelt's aide. During the Depression, Roosevelt put the Army in charge of all the public works projects, which makes sense. Who better than the Army to manage a large group of men working towards a common goal? And of course, Marshall was the best at it and had the best record among any of them and was doing wondrous things. And he came under the notice of Hopkins, who was obviously a big part of the New Deal programs. Hopkins at one time came to him to say, hey, I hear a lot about the Army and I get a sense we're unprepared. Can you describe that to me? And he was so impressed with Marshall's answers that he went up to Roosevelt when it was time to pick a new chief of staff. And he said, you really should consider this guy Marshall. He knows a great deal. So that's how he got to where he was.
Is it fair to say, and we'll move on quickly, but I've read this multiple times, that Marshall had a soft spot for Patton? As I recall, he referred to him as Georgie, and he called Bradley Eisenhower. The list goes on. But there was something, and maybe it's what you say. Look, we're going to need men. I don't want this guy in my office next door, but when it comes time to killing the enemy, we need people like Patton. And I just thought the fact that he called him Georgie was just particularly funny.
I don't know how often he called him Georgie. Neither Marshall or Stimson had much of a sense of humor. And Marshall famously, like George Washington, had a personality he almost devised himself at an early age at the Virginia Military Institute. He truly felt that to lead men, you can't be close to him. No one ever would call him anything but General Marshall. And Roosevelt made the mistake of calling him George once, and he gave him a death stare, and Roosevelt never did it again. So he did value the relationship with Patton, but they weren't close friends. Marshall only had one really close friend, as far as I can tell, and that was Field Marshal of the British Army. And that was during the war, and they had a real relationship to when Dill died in 1944. Marshall was heartbroken and went out of his way to get him buried at Arlington National Cemetery and put up a large equestrian statue, one of only two that are at Arlington. The other, I think, being Phil Sheridan. But yes, he thought very highly of Patton's capabilities, as did Stimson. Stimson and Marshall were friends going way back. They traveled in the same circles. Their wives were friends. They rode horses.
Stimson and Patton, you mean?
Sorry, Stimson and Patton. Yeah, Stimson and Patton.
It's World War II. I hate to put it that way, but let's get to the heart of the matter. I love the backstories of both these men because of the way they collided, and I mean that in a positive way, and that their views of what it was going to take to win seemed to be amazingly in concert. Even though there were strategic pressures, there were certainly political pressures, societal pressures, financial pressures to let's do it a different way. And we can get into that. And by that, specifically Europe first, as opposed to Admiral King and the Navy, who wanted to fight Japan first. How did Stimson and Marshall's strategic view of fighting the war, how did it align?
I would say it aligned perfectly. They both wanted to, as I think John McCloy, who was on the staff of Stimson, said, Stimson was a storm the parapet guy, if I'm pronouncing that word right. They both wanted to go from day one, just put all the resources towards the invasion of France. And the British, of course, never wanted to do that right up until the eve of D-Day. So they were very aligned from a strategic standpoint. I think the collaboration between the British and the U.S. worked out very well. The U.S. was right in that Germany would have never surrendered unless we invaded France. But I think the British were right that 1943 might have been too early to do it. Stimson and Marshall were in agreement with almost everything. They had two disagreements that I can recall. The biggest was Stimson felt early in the war that a lot of the leaders, the officers, should be civilians, doctors, lawyers, bankers, people that are successful in real life. And there was a precedent for that during World War I. There were some camps called the Plattsburgh camps where wealthy guys would pay themselves to get trained, and a lot of them were officers. And Marshall believed exactly the opposite. He said, to lead men, you have to know what it's like to be hungry, to sleep outside for 30 days in a row, to crawl on your belly, to be under fire. And it got to be fairly heated relative to how these guys' conversations could go, which was never that far. But to a point where Marshall actually threatened to resign. He felt pretty bad about that. And Stimson immediately backed off and later admitted that Marshall had been completely right. The other area of disagreement was Marshall always wanted to put as many men into the army as possible. And Marshall thought, for political reasons, and also because thought that you needed men also to serve in industry. So there was a bit of differences there. But other than that, they were always lockstep in terms of what they believed should be the strategy. And if they weren't, Stimson took a back seat because Marshall was the main guy and he always had his back.
Let's ask a question about that in the chain of command. Is it fair to say that Stimson was George Marshall's boss, or was the President of the United States his direct boss?
Yes.
That's a great answer, because we know nobody was Admiral King's boss.
Roosevelt did something a little before the war. He changed some language in some legislation that basically said, when it comes to strategic military ideas, that the chief of staff can report directly to him. So Marshall reported both to Stimson and he reported directly to Roosevelt. And that wasn't a reflection on Stimson. It was before he named Stimson. Roosevelt liked to control things, so he wanted that language in there. He wanted to be able to talk to Marshall without having to talk to whoever the Secretary of War was going to be. Regardless, Marshall had this great respect for the chain of command, and he actually included, there were never any secrets between them. I mentioned the open door. Mm-hmm. I think the only secret I could ever remember, I think Roosevelt swore Marshall to secrecy when they met the British in Newfoundland before the war, and Stimson wasn't even aware he'd gone. Outside of that, I don't know if anything either man withheld from the other.
We alluded to it at the beginning of the podcast, but a big part of Secretary of War Stimson's and Chief of Staff Marshall's duties was figuring out how to get along with the Navy, which was a little bit tougher because famously President Franklin Roosevelt would refer to the Navy as we, since he had served as Assistant Secretary of Navy in World War I. How did Ernest King, who was Chief of Naval Operations, for lack of a better term, and Secretary of the Navy, it was Forrestal, and I forget who it was before then, get along?
Knox.
Yes, Frank Knox, forgive me.
Frank Knox,
How did they all get along and win the war and not give Franklin Roosevelt migraines every day?
There's a lot to that. I think let's just start with Stimson. Got along very famously with Frank Knox. I think years earlier, Teddy Roosevelt had come to him and introduced Frank Knox to him years earlier and said, this is one of our guys. So they'd had a long friendship. So at the top, it was good. In terms of King, known to be the most difficult guy in the military, I think everyone in the army, everyone in the Navy hated King. He just wasn't a liked guy. His daughter said he was very even-tempered. He was always in a rage. That was her quote. Early in the war, or before the war started, in the buildup, and by the way, about a third of this book is really the buildup, where I think what they did was remarkable. We had 170,000 soldiers when World War II started. We had 300 working airplanes. We had 40 tanks. And you compare that, the Nazis had 6 million soldiers, 3,000 planes, 2,500 tanks. And these guys, over the course of those 17 months, against this background of isolationism, managed to build the army up to 5.5 million, built enough beds for barracks for 1.2 million people, built 4,500 tanks in 2 years and 25,000 planes. It was remarkable. I call it the greatest feat of management in the history of the world. And no one's really called me on that. But back to your question, early when they were introduced, King came over to Marshall's office unannounced, and Marshall was meeting someone very important from the Norwegian government, so couldn't see him. And King took great offense to this and yelled at Marshall's secretary and stormed out. And Marshall came out of the meeting and was told what happened. He walked over to King's office and said, listen, I was meeting some very important official from Norway. I'm sorry. But let me just tell you, we need to get along. If we don't get along, none of this is going to work. And King, right there on the spot, just said, I agree. I'll do my best. And they had a working relationship. I think they also had a little agreement. It wasn't perfect, but it was King basically said, look, I'll let you take the lead when it comes to Europe, but you need to give me the lead when it comes to Japan. They both broke it a few times, but that's how they managed to work together. Is King just stayed out of the way when it came to Europe and demanded that he have a seat at the table when it came to Japan.
Let's talk about that for just a second. You actually anticipated my next series of questions when you were talking about the statistics, because I want to talk about that, because you do a terrific job in your book of explaining Marshall's mastery of the necessary logistics it's going to take to win a war, to win a battle, be victorious in any particular theater. We associate General Marshall mostly with Europe. I think that's for obvious reasons, perhaps the ones you just described, among others. I just read an excellent biography of Chester Nimitz, Craig Simons wrote a couple of years ago. And if you haven't read, that's right up your alley, Ted. You would enjoy it very much. Anyway, in the Pacific, you had Douglas MacArthur. Now, my understanding is MacArthur, who was awarded the Medal of Honor after escaping the Japanese, he was recommended for the Medal of Honor by Marshall. Correct me if I'm wrong on that, please. They clearly had known each other for decades. MacArthur was chief of staff in the Army well before World War II. Now Marshall is chief of staff. How did they... I need to reread John McManus's books on the Army in the Pacific, but how did they get along, and how did Marshall handle MacArthur's ego, legend, temperament? Because you could say Eisenhower and Bradley and Clark and Patton and all those folks, them being subordinate to Marshall, that makes perfect sense. MacArthur's a whole nother story.
He is a whole nother podcast, but I'll try to. Marshall was a remarkable individual. I put him, for my personal list, I put him right behind Lincoln and Washington as the greatest American in our history. And I'll tell you a story that gives evidence of that. So MacArthur couldn't stand anyone who worked on Pershing's staff. The so-called Chaumont crowd, again, if I'm pronouncing that French word right, where they were located in France during World War I. And he was paranoid. He thought they were out to get him and stifling him along the way. And he did everything he could to slow down Marshall's career. At one point, President Roosevelt wanted to promote Marshall to general, and he had the support of Pershing and a bunch of other people. MacArthur was chief of staff and rejected it. Another time, I mentioned that during the Depression, Marshall was given some great assignments where he was leading these huge public works programs and getting a lot of press for it. Marshall, in an apparent fit of jealousy or another way to stifle him, randomly just chose him and sent him for 3 years to Illinois to train the National Guard there. He was absolutely out to get Marshall. So it is remarkable that when the war started, MacArthur was retired. He was heading the Philippine Army. Marshall brought it out of retirement. He didn't need to, but he just said, this is a great man. This is a guy who's worshipped by soldiers, can get people to fight. So he promoted him and supported him. He got tough when he wanted to. I think everyone had a little fear of Marshall. Famously, Churchill, it was said that Marshall was the only man, period, that Churchill feared. And the reason was because of his integrity. Integrity can be a really powerful weapon and can really cause people like gregarious, aggressive people like Churchill and MacArthur to fear people who are just honest as the day is long. And it worked very well for him during the war to have that integrity, and it allowed Marshall to keep MacArthur in check as much as one could keep Marshall in check. And it's one of the reasons he didn't get to command D-Day. I think when Roosevelt really wanted to name Marshall as commander, but he realized that Marshall had the respect of everyone in the Army, everyone in the Navy, including Admiral King. He had the respect of MacArthur. You think Eisenhower could have kicked MacArthur around? No chance, because Eisenhower worked for MacArthur in the Philippines and Congress. So he chose Eisenhower because Marshall was truly indispensable. And part of it was he could control MacArthur, who was otherwise uncontrollable.
I'm laughing. I'm laughing to myself a few minutes ago. You mentioned that Franklin Roosevelt called General Marshall George one time, and General Marshall let it be known that was unacceptable. Yet in meetings, Franklin Roosevelt would be called Franklin by Douglas MacArthur, even after Roosevelt was president. He wasn't Mr. President to Douglas MacArthur. He was Franklin. Now you're talking about the ego you're trying to tame.
It's funny you say that. I give a standard presentation on that I've been giving for a couple of years since this book was published, and I always end the presentation by talking about how one of the characteristics of Marshall was his belief in that the military should always be subordinate to the civilian authorities in America. It's one of the things that made America great. And I prove it by showing all the photos that I could find of Stimson and Marshall together. And in each one, and some videos as well, Stimson is always, or rather, Marshall is always 2 steps behind Stimson. Always. It's no coincidence, wherever it is. And I tell the audience that if it were MacArthur, he'd be 10 steps ahead. He had a great respect for the chain of command.
You mentioned logistics. I got just a few more topics because I know we're running close to the end of our time together. We're talking with Ted Aldrich about his book, The Partnership, George Marshall, Henry Stimson, and the Extraordinary Collaboration That Won World War II. There's a thought, and I'm guilty of it as much as anyone, that Pearl Harbor is December 7th, 1941, and 6 weeks later, we're churning out 10,000 tanks a month, and we've got all these planes, and we're fighting in all these places. Obviously, it didn't happen that way. And that the spin up of American industry, while also balancing the manpower needs of the military with our industry, which obviously was then ably aided by female Americans. But the industrial power of the United States wasn't a switch. It was a process. Edward Grey, who was English or British foreign minister during World War I, famously said that the United States is like a gigantic boiler. There is no limit to the heat it can produce once lit. How did Stimson manage the almost unfathomable industrial output and production and priorities?
It's a great question. And I'll start by just giving an anecdote of Pearl Harbor, the actual day, December 7th. I had Stimson's diary, 4,000 pages during the war. And on December 7th, he was almost giddy. He just said, the indecision's over. This is great. We are going to be able to win this war. And he was very excited, whereas Marshall was devastated. And the reason was all the things I've said before. Stimson knew about once you light the furnace, we would be able to outproduce all the other nations combined with a couple of years, which is what happened. Marshall, of course, was a career Army guy. He didn't quite have that. Despite working for Stimson for 17 months, he didn't quite have that experience. But I think that I spent a lot of time during my presentations talking about their staff. I mentioned the little black book. So Marshall had great people working for him, but Stimson had the best staff, widely considered overwhelmingly considered the best staff in Washington. It was made up of basically 5 guys, all who went to Harvard Law, all who were either like number 1 or number 2 in their class at Harvard Law, along with Robert Lovett, who was founder of Brown Brothers Harriman. You had John McCloy, you had Robert Patterson. These guys were tremendous, not just brains, but their ability to get things done. So you ask how it was that they could go from 170,000 people to 6 million and 300 planes to 3,000. These guys had to do this. They had to use the staffs. They had to use all the resources. They hired these people that, plenty of books written about the people who were hired from industry to help the dollar a year men. And at the top of it sat Marshall and Stimson looking after these guys. They all respected them. And the real challenge was the balance. If they moved too quickly, Roosevelt wouldn't be reelected in November of 1940. If they moved too slowly, we wouldn't have been prepared. That period of time, they really had to just do it perfectly. And reading Stimson's diary allowed me to understand the 25 to 30 different things he had to do a day. Much of it was towards that. And fighting problems. Like when Hitler wanted to order planes, you go to Messerschmitt and you give them the whole contract. When Marshall and Stimson needed aluminum, they sent out a bid, and Alcoa came back, lowest price, highest quality, quickest delivery. They wanted to give him most of it, but of course the new dealers were like, you can't do that. We're a nation that doesn't want to have monopolies. So it was remarkable what they did, and hence that's why I call it this great feat of management. Fighting a war when you're a democracy is tough, and these guys were just the perfect person to manage it.
I want to be sure to bring up two topics before we close with the 5 questions, which, because I know you listen to the podcast, for which we are very grateful, I know you are prepared for the 5 questions.
Yeah, I'll zip them out pretty quick.
D-Day, the invasion of Normandy in June of 44. You mentioned a few minutes ago, we were hot to get into Europe. The British, somewhat condescendingly, were like, you have no idea what you're talking about. Hitler's armies are going to eat you alive. We've actually fought these men. You haven't. The buildup happens. What was Marshall's and Stimson's role in making D-Day happen?
Before I answer that question, I will tell you that the British, it wasn't so much they just thought it was going to be a bloodbath. The British truly felt that Germany could be defeated just by air or blockade. And just wasn't the case. Hitler proved that by not giving up and finally killing himself when the Russians were on one side of the bunker and the British and the Americans were on the other side. It was really, they just felt that's how the war could be won, just by bombing. And we tried, but it didn't work. So their role on D-Day, getting the right men and supporting the men. The reason books aren't written about these guys is they were in Washington, sitting in comfortable offices, and people don't love to read about books like that. But they were heavily involved in all the things that these guys required, and they were making it happen, negotiating with the British. All the equipment coming out of factories in America, everyone wanted all of it. And Stimson and Marshall were required to basically say, no, we need to give the Soviets this, we need to give the British this, we need to keep this ourselves, give the Chinese this. So they were handling all that and making sure people didn't ask for too much. If they felt he was asking for too much, they would push back on it. Marshall had this belief that you make do with what you have. And if I can just tell you one quick anecdote about explain this to Patton. He sent Patton to the deserts of the Southwest to prepare for North Africa, and he sent him with a division. And Patton came back to him a few weeks later saying he needs a second division. Marshall relieved him on the spot, ordered him to get on a plane, head to California, and then wouldn't take his call for 8 days. And Patton was going crazy, of course. And finally, through a mutual friend, Patton got word to Marshall that he could probably manage with one division. So Marshall put Patton back on a plane and sent back to the desert. So this is how they supported them.
A few seconds ago, you talked about Franklin Roosevelt and George Marshall. I couldn't sleep at night if you were out of the country.
Yeah.
Marshall, is it fair to say, as much as George Marshall wanted anything, he wanted to command Operation Overlord?
There's no doubt, but the remarkable thing about him is no one has proof. He wouldn't even tell his wife either before or after the war. This is the kind of man he was. He wouldn't even tell his wife whether he wanted the assignment. It drove Stimson crazy, and Stimson would constantly ask him, don't you want this? And it was his for the asking. All he had to do was hint that he wanted it. One time Stimson said something, maybe he was just impatient with Stimson. Rather, Marshall said something to Stimson saying, any general would of course want this assignment. That's the closest he ever got. Yes, he wanted it, and he actually thought he had it at one point. Someone told him it was him, and Roosevelt planned to have it as Marshall. And when he was flying over in November 1943 for the Tehran conference, he stopped in Algeria, to meet with Eisenhower. And I'm sure you've read about this in other books. He said to Eisenhower when he got him alone, he said, look, you and I both know who the chief of staff was during the Civil War, but nobody else does. And in 50 years, I don't want George Marshall to be a minor footnote in history. So Eisenhower could only take that as he's going to choose Marshall. Then he flew to Tehran, changed his mind, asked Marshall one more time what he thought about it. And Marshall said, I can't weigh in on this subject since I'm one of the candidates. You have to do what you think is best, pick the strengths and weaknesses of everyone. Just know that whoever you choose, I will support you 100%. And that's when Roosevelt threw up his hands and famously said, I just couldn't sleep without you within Washington, D.C. So it was remarkable.
And Stalin was pressing hard for a supreme commander to be named for the invasion of Western Europe. He didn't think that it was ever going to happen unless they had chosen someone.
Yep.
The other thing I want to ask you about, and this is perhaps maybe a little bit more Stimson than Marshall, and that is the Manhattan Project, the decision to build and then eventually deploy atomic weaponry. How important was Stimson's leadership, especially his business leadership, his ability to get everyone to work together when you have this massive project that is literally happening all over the country?
Well, among the reasons I call it the greatest feat of management, on top of all the things I've talked about so far, Stimson was also in charge of the Manhattan Project. So 130,000 people reporting to him. Just another thing he was responsible for, with Marshall working. It was Stimson in charge of it. Marshall reported to him. Groves reported to him. So when Roosevelt died, Stimson went to the White House and observed Truman getting sworn in. Truman said a few comments after he was sworn in. And then as they were filing out of the room, Stimson tapped Truman on the shoulder and said, listen, I got to tell you something about this thing we're building in the desert. Truman had no idea that an atomic bomb was being built. He was vice president of the United States. Now, he knew something was going on, but he didn't know it was an atomic bomb. So what Truman did, what Stimson said to Truman is, you need to put a committee together to decide on what we're going to do with this technology. And Stimson was named head of that committee. So he was the one in charge of all of that. And he put Groves in charge of the target committee. And he was given the decision, or rather given the responsibility to recommend to Truman what to do. So he was very integral. And it certainly helped that he did have this, going back to his days in the law. When you're working on a giant case, you have to manage a team of lawyers and separate responsibilities. And really, it all came down to people trusted him because of his great integrity. Someone once said, when describing someone in the War Department, said, you're never going to get on paper what exactly he did during the war, but everyone in the War Department did or did not do things because Stimson was sitting at the head of it. So it was something really powerful. And Marshall used to say that every once in a while, some politician would come to him and complain about some weapon being built, not in his district, but someone else's. And Marshall would sit and listen to him and say, you make a good point. I think you should see Secretary Stimson about that. And of course, the guy would slink out of his office because it's like asking to go see Moses about something. They would never approach Stimson about something petty like that.
And you mentioned, or it's been mentioned several times, Truman's investigative committee about the costs of the war and is the American taxpayer dollar being spent wisely and honestly. And he had lots of questions about what turned out to be the Manhattan Project. And this was before he was vice president or president. And Stimson basically just said, trust me, Senator Truman, just trust me on this. And Truman did.
Yep. Yeah. He said, it's important and I can't tell you. And Truman said, that's fine with me. But not everyone could get away with saying that.
Was Henry Stimson part of the reason that George Marshall in December of 1944 received a 5th star? He was the highest ranking Army officer in the war. And is it true that they are not field marshals because George Marshall didn't want to be Field Marshal Marshall?
I don't think that's true, but it's very funny. And Stimson obviously encouraged it. And I think he said to Truman, you can't give this guy a higher honor. But I think if Stimson wasn't around, everyone worshipped and revered Marshall, and he would have gotten the same assignment. It didn't require Stimson to tell the people like Truman or Roosevelt, how good Marshall was. Those guys knew it.
The war in Europe ends in May of 45. The war in the Pacific ends in September of 45. After the war, Stimson is obviously a much older man. What does Henry Stimson do after the war?
Stimson was 78 when the war ended, and 78 back in the 40s was the equivalent of 95 today, right? He was an old man, and I could tell by the diary he was slowing down, by just the way the quality of his writing. He had a heart attack the day that Nagasaki was bombed. But Truman kept him on until his 78th birthday, which was September 28th or thereabouts. And he then had a massive heart attack after that. And the next 5 years, his health just spiraled downward until he died of a heart attack. One of the things he did was, about 2 years after the bomb was dropped, a few people started to write that maybe it wasn't such a good idea. Mm-hmm. And to get ahead of it, they thought, who better than Stimson to write a defense of it? So I think George Bundy, who was a protege of Stimson's and helped him write his memoirs, helped draft the rationale and went into Harper's Magazine. But outside of that, he was very quiet, just living in Long Island at his estate and just trying to recover his health, which fell apart when the war ended.
I cannot think of another general who didn't become president, who became more famous after his service than George Marshall did.
Yeah, there's a story behind that too. I think it should be called the Stimson-Marshall Plan, and here's why. Towards the end of the war, maybe in 44, Secretary Morgenthau, Treasury Secretary, came out with what you probably heard of, the Morgenthau Plan, which is what to do with Germany after the war. and he basically
Sorry, go ahead. I'm just laughing because it's maybe not shocking in 44. It's tremendously shocking in 2024.
He wanted to turn the country into a farm, basically, where all the people are living on sustenance levels, strip it of all industry, shoot a bunch of the top Nazis without a trial, and just keep them barely alive. And he actually, at the Quebec conference, Morgenthau got Roosevelt and Churchill to sign such a thing. And Stimson, when he heard, went crazy. And he would just start yelling at people saying, do you know that there is no Europe without Germany? They are the engine of the European economy. They are a great, hardworking people who have just been given this terrible government and didn't know what to do with it. But he said, you have to have them there also, because the next war is going to be with the Soviet Union. We need a strong Germany. So he fought really hard against that. Churchill and Roosevelt denied that he ever signed such a thing, and they backed off it. And later, during the Marshall Plan, Marshall sent one of his aides to the archives to get the memos that Stimson had written about this at the time to incorporate into his language on the Marshall Plan. So I really felt it should be the Stimson-Marshall Plan.
George Marshall went to China. He served as Secretary of State. He served as Secretary of Defense. He died, I believe, in the late 50s in the presidential suite at Walter Reed Hospital.
Yes.
Where he was kept comfortable by a man named Dwight Eisenhower.
Yes.
It's a very touching scene.
Yeah.
Your book is...
Can I just say one thing about people don't appreciate? He was desperate to retire. Desperate. As soon as the war seemed over, he went to Truman and said, I want to retire. His first wife died of a heart attack. He and his second wife had no time over the 15 years because he was so busy. They had all these plans to do what they wanted to do in the Northwest, was his fish, go to golf tournaments, etc. And so Truman kept him on, finally allowed him to retire. He goes to his home in Virginia, 40 miles away. And they're sitting on the porch. They have the rest of their lives. And his wife says she's going to take a nap, goes upstairs. When she's up there, the day he retired, the afternoon after the morning he retired, same day, in other words, Truman calls and says, General, and he says, yes, Mr. President. He goes, I want you to go to China. And Marshall didn't want to wake up his wife, so he just said, okay, and hung up the phone. Wife comes down an hour and a half later. She's halfway down the stairs. It's top of the hour, and the news is on, and she hears the following. And in other news, President Truman named George Marshall to head a delegation to China. It leaves in the morning. And she's thinking, how long have I been asleep? And he worked for the next 7 years, as you just said. the China Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense. So this is a man was driven by duty. And Robert Lovett, who was very close to him, said he didn't want any of those assignments.
Oh, and the assignment to China, I feel badly for him. They talk about what would I say, a Sisyphean task. There was never anything. He's never going to get anything going on over there. It was so awful.
I often answer the question about that, about his lack of success in China, is saying, imagine if the British sent someone over in 1860 to America saying, it solved the problem between the North and South. Then forget it.
Absolutely. You subtitle your book, The Extraordinary Collaboration That Won World War II. That's a pretty strong. So are you saying by the, I think, inverse, that if there had been no collaboration, we would not have won World War II? So I know that's a dick question, Ted, and I admit that it is, but please
here's the question. It wasn't called that to start with. I thought I was being bold and said won the war in Europe. And this is my first book. I'm not an author. I'm not a historian. So pretty much whatever the publisher wanted. And he said, we're going to change the subtitle to Extraordinary Collaboration that won World War II. And I said, hold on. The Navy had something to do with it. And do you want to sell books? Like, yes, he'd just leave it at this. So I'm throwing the publisher under the bus, but I do think that Marshall was indispensable. I think he was the only one, possibly other than Roosevelt, who was indispensable during the war. Stimson was a great asset, and their teamwork was extraordinary. But I think it would have been very difficult without Marshall. He really did so much.
We've reached the point on the Leaders and Legends podcast where we ask the same 5 questions of all of our guests. Mm-hmm. Mr. Aldrich, are you ready?
Yes.
What was your first job?
It didn't last long, but I used to shine my father's shoes with a really fancy shoe shining equipment. I decided to make money on it, so I went to the local train station in Rowayton, Connecticut, to shine shoes. But I quickly realized it was a losing proposition because it took me 5 minutes to shine someone's shoes, and no one was ever at the train station for more than 30 seconds. So I think I lasted 3 days, and then I mowed lawns after that.
What was your first concert?
First 3 concerts were the Grateful Dead concerts, but I was dragged there by my older brother. I like the Dead albums, but I'm not that keen on Grateful Dead shows. So my first real concert that I chose on my own was Bob Marley at Colgate University my freshman year.
If you could suggest any book for someone to read, which book would you recommend?
I would say any book by Robert Caro. But if I had to choose between them, either The Power Broker or his books on Johnson, I'd go with Master of the Senate. He is the Picasso of biographers, and his books are all just fantastic to read.
Did you read the David Rohl biography of General Marshall?
Yes, I did. David Rohl mentored me during the process of getting my book published, and I've read all his books. I think they're great, including the one on Lewis Johnson that he started off with.
He was a wonderful podcast guest.
Yeah.
Very kind. Loved his book on Truman and Roosevelt and how it all came together after the war.
Yeah. I reached out to him because he wasn't a historian or academic, but he was a lawyer. And being a banker, I just said, how do you approach publishers when you're not, when you're just a lawyer? And he was very helpful.
Number 4, if you could witness any event in history, be there in person as it happens, which event would you choose?
I've been struggling with this one. There's part of me that would love to see dinosaurs. That I think any kid has that dream.
No one has given that answer. I want to see dinosaurs. Terrific.
Yeah, I'll stick with that. But I think if it were more modern, it would probably be the Constitutional Convention. Get as many of the founders in there in one room that I could see as possible.
Last question. If you could have dinner with anyone living today, 2 hours off the record just to chat, whom would you choose?
It'll be either, I would say, I thought about this for a long time too. I think it's going to be either Paul McCartney or Billy Joel to talk about songwriting. I'm a piano player and fancy myself a songwriter, and I'd like to hear how they did it and, what the process is.
But if you had to choose one,
Paul McCartney.
You have been listening to Leaders and Legends, a podcast presented by Veteran Strategies, an Indiana-based public relations enterprise, and sponsored by Garmong Construction, Leaders and Legends LLC, the Grand Hall and Conference Center at Historic Union Station, in the McGinley's Golden Ace Inn. As always, all our podcast interviews are dedicated to the legacy and generosity of World War II veteran P.E. McAllister. Our guest today, Ted Aldrich. His book, The Partnership, George Marshall, Henry Stimson, and the Extraordinary Collaboration That Won World War II. It's a terrific book about putting your ego aside, about leadership, about coming together, about integrity. It's a beautiful read. Ted, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Thank you very much, Robert.
Thank you very much for listening to Leaders and Legends, brought to you by Veteran Strategies Incorporated. If you want to contact us about this program or our menu of public relations services, please send us an email at robert@veteranstrategies.com. That's robert@veteranstrategies.com.